Hello, this is Scott. I'm back, and this month, in alignment with the scope and sequence established by PSJA's Department of Instructional Coaching, our PD is on questioning. As always, please sign your school's sign-in sheet to record your attendance at this webinar. Let's begin with a little turn and talk. So I want you to turn to a colleague and I want you to talk about this question. Why do teachers ask questions? I mean, what is the purpose? What is our purpose for asking questions? I'm going to ask each of you to talk for 30 seconds. One of you will talk first, and I'll tell you when to switch. The person whose birthday is closer to January the 1st goes first, and I'll wait right now just a few seconds while you figure out which of you that is. Are you ready? The first speaker, begin. And switch. And thank you. Well, what kinds of things did you say? Why do we ask questions and what is our purpose? Sometimes we ask questions because we want to find out what the kids know. We use questions for both formative and summative assessment. We use questions for checks for understanding. Sometimes we use questions to get the students to rehearse what they're learning. But the very best kind of questions, and the ones I want you to think about today, are the questions we ask to get the students to think harder, richer, deeper, and more robustly about the content. So, our goals today are that you would know what questioning is and what it accomplishes in the classroom, that you would understand the power of questioning in fostering student achievement, and that you'd be able to incorporate questions in your own lesson plans. Do you remember seeing this in the newsletter? On average, teachers ask how many questions each day? What do you think? Well, the answer is 300 to 400 questions each day. So, in a study, teachers were asked how many questions they thought they asked in a 30-minute period. How many questions do you think teachers estimated that they asked in a 30-minute period? What they said was 30. But how many questions do you think they really asked when they were observed? It's more like 60. So, in a typical class period, what percentage of questions are lower order questions? And what percentage of questions are, say, procedural in nature? And finally, what percentage of questions are higher order thinking questions? So you might be surprised that nearly 80% of the questions asked in a typical classroom are lower level cognitive questions. And almost 15% are procedural questions, like what do you do now? What do you do next? Leaving only 5% as higher order cognitive questions. And then the last piece, what do you think? When students are taught with all lower order questions, where do they score on tests? And when they're taught with higher order questions, Where do they come out on the tests? That's not even a hard question for you. Obviously, when you're taught with lower order questions, you come out in the lower percentile on tests, and when you're instructed with higher order cognitive questions, you come out in the upper percentile on tests. Well, you know you're not going to have a webinar without seeing this slide from me. We've seen it every time. The person doing the talking is the person doing the learning. But I want to make a change. So today we're going to say the person doing the answering is the person doing the learning. Too often, we as teachers carry the burden of the thinking work in the classroom. Are you exhausted at the end of the day? It's because you're doing all the work. We need to have our students take on the burden of the thinking work, and that means answering questions and talking. So let's talk about 3 elements of questioning, 3 things we have to think about in order to do a good job questioning. First, what makes a good question? Second, who answers the question and how? And third, what do we do with the students' responses after they answer? So getting started, let's think about what makes a good question. A better perspective might be what makes a good series of questions. That's because questions should build on previous questions and scaffold upward. A good series of questions addresses all of Bloom's orders of thinking. We said before that most classroom questions are lower order thinking questions and very few are higher order. You know that we want more higher order thinking questions, but don't make the mistake of thinking that we don't want any lower order thinking questions. Actually, we want questions at every level of Bloom's taxonomy. Thus, a series of questions might begin with factual recall and build toward understanding and application of concepts, analysis of parts, and then an evaluation, even creation of new possibilities. If you're familiar with AVID, you might recognize this as a way of looking at the same thing, where level 1 questions are about gathering information and level 2 questions are about processing information, and finally level 3 questions are about applying information. In this month's newsletter, you saw this teaching channel video. The teacher here designs her question in sets of 3. The first question is, quote, one that nearly any student could answer, end quote. She says her second question, quote, builds on the first and asks for more specific information, end quote. And then her third question asks students to make a personal connection with the content. Hey, by the way, you may have noticed that the teacher is reading her questions from her lesson plan. See, this teacher planned her questions ahead of time. According to the CIF Teacher Effectiveness Rubric for Questioning, skilled teachers, quote, prepare purposeful questions in advance of class, but can also ask questions on their feet. Well, we're talking about what makes a good question. Do you remember thinking maps? Tasks that are well suited to thinking maps carry an implied question, and almost always a higher order question at that. And the classroom talking stems we introduced last month also carry an implied question, and again, usually a higher order thinking question. Well, we've looked at what makes a good question, so now let's take a look at who answers the questions. Many of us remember our own teachers telling us to raise our hands to answer a question. Well, students have learned that not raising their hand is code for "don't call on me." And in today's classrooms, every student must be ready to answer all the time. And that's why we encourage the use of cold calling. This power of this technique is the randomness. First, ask the question and then pause. That way, every student is thinking about the answer. Then, call on a student. But the downside of any strategy that calls on one student at a time is that, well, only one student at a time is talking. And in many classes, that's 1 out of 25, or just 4%. 4% certainly is not very high. When you pose a question and then have students turn and talk with a partner, your engagement increases from 4% to 100%. And the same is true when you pose your question to a collaborative group work and all of the students can talk together. So you have a number of options. You can call on one student, you can have students talk to each other, you can have students work in groups, and each of these is a valid strategy for getting students to answer. And of course, we can always have our students answer in writing. One other comment. Craft your questions with carefully controlled language for your English language learners or for your students who are served under special education. And make sure that every child in your class can and does answer questions. Well, now that we've looked at who answers questions, finally it's time to talk about what do we do with the students' responses. The most common questioning sequence is QRE. The teacher asks a Q question, the student R responds, and the teacher E evaluates. This question sequence almost always accompanies lower order questions. You'll see here, which element has an atomic number of 8? The kid says oxygen. The teacher says right. That's a question, a response, an evaluation. We encourage instead the QRQ. The teacher asks a question, the student responds, and the teacher follows up with another question. This one change nearly always ups the rigor of the question series by at least one Bloom's level, and often more. In this example, which element has an atomic number of 8? The student says oxygen, and the teacher says, why is that so? Now, instead of just knowing that oxygen is somehow an 8, the student has to begin explaining how an atomic number is figured and what the makeup of the oxygen atom is, such that its atomic number is 8. By the way, if you're not a chemistry major, you might not remember. The answer has to do with the number of protons. Here are some other teacher responses that we can use to keep the conversation going and to increase rigor after posing a question. So we've looked today at what makes a good question, who we select to answer the questions, and what we do with students' responses. In our face-to-face PD this month, we're going to put our thinking caps on and work out a series of questions using Bloom's taxonomy as a guide. And speaking of our face-to-face PD, you'll find the schedule of PD sessions in this month's newsletter. You won't need to bring your lesson plans to the session, but please come prepared to think of questions that are appropriate to your current lessons. Thanks for watching. Please complete this survey by entering the URL in the web browser of your phone, tablet, laptop, or computer before you leave the room. I'll pause here and let the URL stay on the screen for about a minute, and I'll see you soon at our live PD. Thanks very much.